Okay, scenario 4. This one's about substitute decision makers. A woman in her 50s lives at home with family and is exhibiting life-threatening pica behavior. So this is the ingestion of non-nutritive substances like magnets, rocks, coins, or other dangerous items. They've required a number of emergency surgeries in the past, so ingesting and then requiring either some kind of a scoping or a more invasive procedure to remove the items. The elderly mother is a substitute decision maker, but is not open to behavioral intervention or other clinical supports, and says that the issue isn't a problem, that prayer is sufficient. Mother continues to leave magnets, coins, and other items all around the house, which are regularly ingested by the daughter. So in this situation, what are the options and the appropriate responses for the professionals if they have concerns about the inaction of a substitute decision maker? And maybe Sandy, you can start off.
Right, well, this one would meet our criteria on the face of it for an investigation. If somebody was to call our investigations unit to say, to give us this scenario, I guess where our limitations are is that we could go to court and become this person's guardian of personal care, but we wouldn't necessarily resolve the situation unless there was another plan in place for this for the woman who's in her 50s. So if there was, if the plan for all the care providers involved were saying that maybe she needs to go live in a group home, and the mother's not consenting to that, then that would be a plan that we could go to court to ask to be able to make that decision on our behalf, that shelter decision. And so, but we'd have to see if there's any other less intrusive options, obviously. The other thing I would question is it says, I'm not saying that, when you use the word elderly, you're automatically incapable, because that's not the truth, but, if potentially the substitute decision maker is not, the lacks capacity, so that would be, somebody would need to look into that. But basically, like, if she was to remain in the home and there'd be no value added for our office to become involved, because we can't curb any of this behavior. We're not in there with them taking away the magnets and the coins. So there would have to be a plan in place to remove her from that home in order for us to be of any benefit.
So I'll put it over to you, Tom, because I think there is some obvious kind of ethical issues here. One of the things that stands out for me in this scenario is the idea of the religious inclination or maybe cultural components playing in, and a lot of times with the professionals in the community that are supporting, trying to build rapport with the family, it can be really challenging to navigate both the religious or cultural things that may or may not be contributing to maintenance of challenges.
So that's absolutely right. One of the ethical challenges in a situation like this might be, how does one respect sociocultural or religious beliefs? So, for example, I've been trying to pray the gray away for years. It's not working. But I have every right to do that if I want to do that. Does the mother have the right to sort of pray away the daughter's behaviors? Is that acting in her best interests? What are her best interests? How dangerous is the behavior? Is it dangerous enough to warrant intervention in such a way that praying this away isn't going to work because she's going to die if we don't intervene? Or do we give some latitude? When do we give latitude and why? How and when do we accommodate socio-religious cultural perspectives and behaviors? You run into that all the time. And so it really becomes a challenge to tease out all of the pieces of this, and also thinking about in the context of this woman's in her 50s. I'm assuming that she's lived at home with mom her entire life. What are the risks of pulling her out of that home and institutionalizing her? Does that risk outweigh the risks of the behaviors at home that mom is not controlling? Maybe, maybe not, right? And again, you have to consider what are the risks, what is the actual behavior, and how risky is that to the individual, and is that worth moving her out of the home and away from her support system? There's nothing to indicate in the case before us that mother is not a loving, caring individual. Her approach may well be inappropriate, but her intent may be very appropriate. And so we're thinking about the contextual features. This one is layered with contextual features that you need to do a deeper dive into to get an understanding of. We certainly have a variety of options available to us here. Which one are we going to choose and why? And is that really the one at the end of the day that is most appropriate versus the one that is the path of least resistance? So I've got 30 things to do today. I've got to get through this case so I can get on to my next case. What's the quickest, easiest thing to do so that I can move on to the next case? That may not be the right headspace to be in when you've got something this complex.
Thank you. Kendra, does the law have any tools that can help us in this very complex situation?
Possibly. So I think, one of the first things that comes to mind is how acute or how much of an emergency is this, right? Because if this swallowing behavior is very frequent and is very high risk, the Mental Health Act provides the opportunity to have her admitted to hospital if the behavior is stemming from an underlying mental disorder and it's putting her health or life at risk. Then that would be make her meet the criteria for involuntary admission to a psychiatric hospital, which would create a lot of opportunity in terms of perhaps putting in some behavioral therapies or other treatments to address these behaviors. So maybe we can get the behaviors under control so that she can go home to live with mom safely. Or it might remove her from the immediate danger long enough to find a more appropriate housing situation and potentially engage the public guardian if there's a need for somebody else to making decisions around that. So absolutely, that's something that would be available in the law in order to manage this behavior. As Tom points out, though, I would always recommend approaching that with a deliberateness and a bit of advanced planning in terms of if we're going to initiate a hospitalization, what is the goal of that hospitalization? We don't want to be in a situation where we're just basically locking her up in a hospital for the rest of her life. So, and is a hospitalization going to be beneficial or going to create opportunities to help her, in which case there are those tools. But I think as healthcare providers, it would behoove us to think about whether there are other options that we can do to keep her in the community and still keep her safe, if that's a possibility as well.
Great, thank you. And I'm wondering also specifically about if it does get to the point with the substitute decision maker where everyone's kind of hit a wall and it's deemed that the individual isn't actually acting in the best interest of their loved one, what next?
So if there's a treatment that's being proposed and the substitute decision maker is not consenting to that treatment, and the team proposing the treatment believes that that decision is not in the incapable person's best interest, there is an ability to apply to a tribunal called the Consent and Capacity Board for a determination of whether the substitute decision maker is acting in the person's best interests. That's often colloquially referred to as a Form G application, G as in George, because that's the name of the actual form that you fill out. And essentially what happens is there's a hearing, which is sort of like a mini court proceeding, although it's more informal. And if the board determines that the substitute decision maker is not acting in the person's best interests, then the board can order the substitute decision maker to make a particular decision. So within 30 days, for example, the substitute decision maker has to consent to the treatment. And if they don't, then they're deemed to be not an eligible substitute decision maker, and another family member would assume that role, and if there is no other family member, then the PGT would become the decision maker. That can be a very useful tool for healthcare providers who are encountering difficulties with SDMs that aren't making decisions. But it's important to remember that it's also inserting an adversarial legal process into a clinical and therapeutic relationship. And when one of these hearings happens, the patient has a lawyer, the family has a lawyer, and the healthcare team has a lawyer. And as I always say, with all due respect to my own profession, when everybody has a lawyer, then any hope of, I think, collaborating therapeutically in the future is in jeopardy. And so that's not a step to be taken lightly. And I think it really does behoove a healthcare team to see if there's a collaborative way of arriving at the same result before going to that route. But if it's necessary, or if it's an emergency, or if you really can't get there, then that is another option that healthcare providers do have.
Thank you. Cindy?
And just from a case management lens, I would also say, like, what services is this woman currently linked to? Can we put anything inside the home to help alleviate the situation, maybe get some crisis staffing? Can we initiate some supports outside in the community? Like, maybe there's, like, what does the actual client want as opposed to her mom, right? So, and how can we support her and try to work together so the mom feels we're working collaboratively and with her? And because, for instance, maybe the individual is bored and wants to be connected to a program, connected to the community, linked to service. So just kind of looking at the whole picture. Thanks.